Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm Rachel Yakino. On this week's episode, we start with an update on recent discussions between the White House and Mexico on the current situation at the southwest border. Then we'll introduce today's special guest, Aaron Reichlin-Melnick, Policy Counsel at the American Immigration Council, for a timely discussion of his research on asylum-seekers and how, despite common rhetoric, they do indeed show up for their immigration hearings. More of that to come. Stick around. The current situation at the border continues to headline newspapers across the United States. Last week, senior White House officials visited Mexico and Guatemala in a bid to address the increasing number of asylum-seeking migrants reaching the U.S. southern border. And the pressure from Republicans on the Biden administration to take more aggressive measures continues. In addition, President Biden named Vice President Kamala Harris to lead U.S. efforts with Mexico and Central America's Northern Triangle countries to try and manage the outmigration from the region. To help us unpack these recent developments is This Week regular Teresa Cardinal-Brown. Teresa, welcome back. So these high-level meetings between the U.S. and Mexico come as apprehensions at the southern border are on pace to hit levels not seen in 20 years. Can you talk a little bit about what the discussions have covered thus far and what they hope to achieve?
Well, thanks so much. So with Mexico, there's been a few different conversations that we are aware of via press reports and things that the administration has said. So we know that the Mexican president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, called President Biden shortly after his inauguration to congratulate them. They had a cordial conversation and they knew they would have to talk about migration, but they didn't really dive in. But they had a bilateral virtual meeting at the beginning of March. And we know a few things that came out of that. For example, we know that AMLO, as he's called, the Mexican president, talked to President Biden about expanding legal work visas for Mexicans and other Central Americans, something that the Biden administration has proposed, expanding green cards in its legislation, but we've talked about, but has not really expanded temporary visas. And in fact, the COVID bans on temporary visas were still in place until just today, March 31st, when we're recording this. We also know they had a conversation about the United States giving excess vaccines to Mexico. And we think that may have been a carrot, if you will, for Mexico to assist more with migration, particularly at its border with Guatemala. We also know that Mexico has sent more National Guard to its Guatemala border to deal with the influx of migrants, particularly with children. They have also sent some of its National Migration Institute, or INAMI, officials down there as well. But we are still seeing the majority of families and migrants that are leaving Central America are not being stopped in Mexico. They are making it to the U.S. border, as recent data has shown. Then the Biden administration sent a delegation to Mexico City. Roberta Jacobson, the former Obama and Trump U.S. ambassador to Mexico, who is now the president's if you will, border czar, they're calling her, but member of the National Security Council in the White House advising him on that. And Juan Gonzalez, who's a National Security Council staffer responsible for Western Hemisphere, traveled down to Mexico City, again, to engage in talks around managing migration. What we know from those conversations is that that they spoke a lot about development assistance, particularly in southern Mexico, and working together to promote development in the countries of Central America that migrants are coming from. The hope was that by working together on that development, there could be job opportunities either for migrants in southern Mexico, which Mexico really wants to develop the economy down there for its own people, but also in the region. They also talked about having to find other ways for safe, orderly, and lawful migration. But we're not entirely sure what that means yet. Mexico, after those meetings and in between, in its Mexican press, has expressed some concern. AMLO has expressed some concern that Biden's openness to immigration is one of the reasons that more migrants are coming through Mexico. And he has said that he's concerned that that is leading to more of them being essentially putting money into the hands of the criminal smuggling networks, that they have created a market, and that is problematic for Mexico. So I think we're at the very beginnings of these conversations. We are nowhere near the end, and it's unclear exactly what concrete steps Mexico might take to help address the migration at the U.S.-Mexico border right now.
So speaking of the delegation, Biden named Vice President Kamala Harris to lead U.S. efforts with Mexico and the Northern Triangle countries to try and stem the flow of migration. So the daughter of immigrants herself, what do you think Harris will bring to the table, and what kind of challenges does she face?
So this designation is quite interesting. When President Biden was vice president to Barack Obama, he was given essentially the same task as we were seeing the increase in Central American migration in 2013 and 2014 to negotiate with Mexico, and particularly with Central America, to address the root causes down there. And he was one of the people who negotiated a broad regional development program called the Alliance for Prosperity that directed U.S. aid in the region for many, many years until the Trump administration decided to cut most of it off. So he's sort of handing Kamala Harris the same stick, if you will, that he was handed by Barack Obama, passing the baton off to his new vice president. As you mentioned, she is the daughter of immigrants and is from California, which is a border state. But one of the issues for her when she was running for president was that she didn't have a lot of foreign policy experience. So this may be an avenue for her to gain some foreign policy experience on an issue that is frankly front and center for the administration. She hasn't yet traveled south of the border, but she did have a call with the Guatemalan president, President Giammattei, in which they talked about areas such as development in Guatemala, assistance to those who have suffered greatly after the hurricanes. We know that President Giammattei asked Vice President Harris about providing temporary protected status for Guatemalans already in the country. So I think where we're starting in these conversations is sort of getting a sense of what these countries want from the United States, and then kind of what the United States can give or might want to give to these countries. I will also say that, certainly she is going to be assisted an awful lot by Ambassador Jacobson and folks at State Department. When Roberta Jacobson gave a press conference at the White House some weeks back, she did make a very serious point that American aid to the region would have to go directly to those who are most affected, who would most use it, and not necessarily to the governments. The United States has some issues with some of the governments in Central America, in particular right now with the president of Honduras, who has been an unindicted co-conspirator on several American drug cases over the last few years, and has been accused of an awful lot of corruption in his country. The president of El Salvador is also someone who is rather young, has a very different way of managing than maybe the United States government is used to. And so we have to kind of see how those relationships will develop. And again, I think just as I said earlier, we're still at kind of early stages to see what might come out of this.
So I want to turn to recently released data from Mexico last week. So last week, the Cato Institute released interesting findings on Mexican immigration enforcement efforts. After analyzing this enforcement data, they found that 92% of Central American children and families bypass Mexican enforcement and reach the United States. Can you talk to us about the implications of these findings and what it might mean for future talks between the U.S. and Mexico?
Yeah, so this was some of the reporting that I mentioned before. And I think, one of the things that's important for us to do more, I think, in the United States, and particularly among the press, is we need to look at what's happening in Mexico so we understand what is going to happen at the U.S.-Mexico border. And, looking at Mexican data, it is true that of the people they apprehend, many of them have been released and then make their way to the U.S.-Mexico border. Some of this is due to new laws in Mexico that restrict the ability of Mexican authorities to detain children or families with small children. And again, we are seeing that many of the folks coming to the US-Mexico border are that demographic, unaccompanied children or families with very young children. So since Mexico is not able under its own laws to detain them, even if they encounter these migrants in some sort of enforcement action, they are either not deporting them back or are releasing them into the country. And then they continue to make their way to the US-Mexico border. We do know that Mexico has made some efforts at addressing the transit routes and the means by which families and other migrants make their way to the US-Mexico border. They have been conducting more patrols of, for example, the railroad that comes up through Central America that the migrants call La Bestia, or the Beast. There's been pictures for decades of migrants who clamber aboard the top of this moving train, sometimes very dangerously, to make their way north. The Mexican government has on and off, started enforcing along the Bestia so that migrants are not able to use that train as a means of coming up through the country. They have also cracked down a little bit on some of the major highways that come up through Mexico that smugglers have been using, frankly, with charter buses and other vehicles as a way of bringing migrants up. So they are doing some, but I think what we're seeing is it's not nearly the crackdown, if you will, that they were doing under the Trump administration early on. And I in general, we have written about this, that there are limitations to how much any government, particularly the United States, can rely on other countries to crack down on migration that's not destined for that country, but is going through that country, right? And I think we're seeing some of those limitations with Mexico. Mexico has already said that it's not going to take back many of the families that the United States might want to expel under the Title 42 regulations, and that's causing the United States to take those families in. And so I think we're seeing sort of some maybe exhaustion, if you will, on the part of Mexico in dealing with what they see as a U.S. migration problem.
Thank you so much, Teresa. This is definitely something that we will continue tracking and talking about here on the podcast.
Absolutely.
We now turn to the second half of this week's episode, a special conversation between Teresa Cardinal-Brown and Aaron Reichlin-Melnick of the American Immigration Council. Aaron serves as policy counsel at AIC, where he works primarily on immigration court issues and the intersection of immigration law and policy. Aaron holds a JD from Georgetown University Law Center and a BA in Politics and East Asian Studies from Brandeis University. Aaron, welcome to the show. I'll leave you in Teresa's capable hands.
Aaron, thank you for joining us. We wanted to have you on to talk about your extensive research on asylum seekers and their rates of appearance at their immigration court hearings. Given the current situation of families and children arriving at the southern border, we imagine again that the argument that immigrants do not show up to their hearings will likely resurface, especially as we're hearing reports that more and more families are being released into the United States. So before we launch into the data, can you first just discuss the processes we're talking about? When families arrive at the border and are processed for asylum or removal, what happens next?
Well, first off, thank you for having me. And so jumping straight into the processes at the border, it's important to note that what was the standard asylum process just 2 or 3 years ago has now broken down into a wide variety of different processes and systems and outcomes that can occur when a family comes to the border and asks for protection. So beginning last year with the creation of the so-called Title 42 process of expulsions, many families have been turned away from the border with no right to seek asylum at all, either sent back to Mexico or simply placed on a plane and deported to their home countries with no right to seek protection in the first place. Mm-hmm. We saw this, for instance, with Haitian families who were stuck on planes and sent back to Haiti. That is still going on right now. But at the same time, we have reached a point where the Border Patrol is unable to expel as many families as they would like to, largely due to operational difficulties and Mexico's refusal to accept people seeking asylum, refusal to accept expulsions. And so as a result, we are seeing what we saw again in 2019. Many families being released from detention. And so right now, a family arriving at the border could be processed in a wide variety of different ways, but the most likely outcome would be either being expelled back to Mexico or stuck on a deportation plane to their home country, or allowed into the United States and given a court date for a hearing, for an upcoming hearing. And while that's the current state of the border, within just a couple of years ago, there were even more options. People could be sent briefly to a family detention center where they'd be held for 15 to 20 days and given what's known as a credible fear interview, which if they passed, they'd be allowed to enter the United States. And if they failed, they'd be deported. As late as last year and as late as right before the inauguration, some families were still being sent back to Mexico under the so-called migrant protection protocols as well. But right now, in March 2021, the two main options, generally speaking, are expulsion to Mexico or release into the United States with a court date.
Yeah. So that's due, we should clarify, it's due to a couple of changes at the border that the Biden administration has implemented, right? They stopped putting new people into the migrant protection protocols and are in fact letting people that were in that program back into the country. And they're not using family detention, although it still exists, correct?
That's right. And so when we talk about, the effect of ending the Remain in Mexico Migrant Protection Protocols program, it is important to note, however, that it didn't have much of an actual concrete effect on the border. Between April 2020 and MPP being ended on January 20th, 2021, less than 1.2% of people put into who were encountered at the border were put into MPP. Only about 6,000 people total over that long period.
Right. The Title 42 was the primary means of dealing with them at that point.
That's right. And even family detention had largely been transformed because of Title 42. Beginning also when Title 42 went into place, most of the families who were in family detention were not there being given credible fear interviews. They were actually being held while ICE got a plane together to deport those families, which is why by summer and fall 2020, the majority of families in family detention centers were actually Haitians, because it wasn't possible to fly planes directly, like deportation flights directly from the border to Haiti. They had to take families, hold them either in hotel rooms or in family detention centers. And then when they'd have enough people to put on a plane, they would deport them back to Haiti, which led to extraordinarily ridiculous situations where Title 42, which was supposedly about public health, was being applied to people who'd already been in the United States for weeks, who the government could have easily tested to find out whether they had COVID or not. Not people who had just entered, people who'd been in a detention center in the middle of Texas for days or weeks at a time were being expelled supposedly in the name of public health.
Right. So the Biden administration has exempted unaccompanied children from those Title 42 expulsions. Technically, it hasn't exempted families from the Title 42 expulsions, but Mexico has said they're not taking some back, more are arriving, and they are choosing not to exercise Title 42 to send them back to their home countries. Instead, many of them are being released. So let's talk about this, because as we recall, back in 2018 and 2019, during the Trump era, this release of families into the United States, the Trump administration called catch and release. They vowed to end it. And one of the primary arguments they had against this policy was the idea that families just would never show up to their hearings, right? They'd be given a notice to appear before an immigration court and would never show up. You have rebutted that claim at every single point, as I recall, and wrote what I consider probably right now the definitive research on that. So let's talk about that. What is the rate at which families do not appear for hearings? And can you describe the different types of hearings that we're talking about?
Yes. So when we're talking about hearings, we're talking about immigration court hearings held in non-detained settings. Those immigrants who are held in an ICE detention center, generally speaking, don't get ordered removed for missing court because they are in government custody, though there are some circumstances where that does happen. I know of at least one case where an immigrant, a mentally ill immigrant in a detention center, refused to leave his cell for a court hearing because he was protesting his treatment, and the judge ordered him deported for missing court. So it's not that it never happens, but it's very rare. But generally, we're talking about people in the 1.3 million case backlog in immigration courts around the country. So these are people who are given a court date and said, you need to show up at this court hearing at this date and this time, or else you will be ordered deported. And under the law, if ICE can prove that the person had been given adequate notice of their court hearing, and that can include simply requiring ICE to prove that they mailed it to the right address, then an immigration judge is required by law to order a person deported if they don't show up for the hearing.
Okay.
And so when we ask this question, how many people show up for court, it's a little bit tricky to say exactly how many asylum seekers show up for court, because the definition of asylum seeker is a bit murky. What we can say is, if we look at immigrants as a whole, from 2008 to 2018, research done by Professors Ingrid Eagley and Stephen Schaefer showed that out of 2.8 million hearings that occurred over that 11-year period, immigrants appeared for court 83% of the time. So that is more than 4 out of 5 cases the immigrant appeared for every single scheduled hearing.
Now, are those immigrants that were not in detention?
These are all non-detained immigrants.
All non-detained immigrants, right?
Only non-detained immigrants. So not taking into account those immigrants having hearings in detention centers, looking only at a 2.8 million hearings held in non-detained immigration courts around the country. Immigrants showed up over an 11-year period. They showed up for court 83% of the time. And this is a pretty consistent number over the last decade. I did my own analysis of this that you mentioned, in 2019, and I'm referencing a 2020 paper from Eagley and Schaefer. And even if you extend that from 2018 to 2019 and you take into account 2019 data, it's still 83%. So over 11 and 12 years straight, immigrants have showed up for court 83% of all the time. And another important thing to note is, of those 17% who did miss court, 1 in 5 will later successfully reopen their court hearing, and usually on the grounds that it was the government that failed to provide them adequate notice of that hearing, because that's actually one of the only ways that you can successfully overturn an order for missing court. There's only 2 ways to do it, to overturn an order for missing court. If you can show within 6 months of missing that court hearing that there were extraordinary circumstances for missing court, you can overturn your order of removal for missing court, or at any point, if you can show that you didn't get adequate notice from the government. And we see, when you go back a number of years, 4 or 5 years after most orders are issued, that rate rises to 1 in 5 of all 1 in 5 orders of removal for missing court are later successfully overturned.
Okay. So this is a far cry from the numbers that we heard, for example, from ICE during the Trump era, where they said, only 30% of the family members were showing up to court at all. To what do you describe these discrepancies? Like, this is a wide variation. You're saying that, over 80% show up for their hearings, and of the remainder, eventually they come back to hearings. Why do you think it's such a big difference in how this is calculated and what the government's saying?
So the main reason we have these wildly different numbers are methodological. Is a methodological flaw in the government's measurement. So the government uses a measurement they call the in absentia rate, and in absentia is the term for a removal order that somebody misses court. It's Latin for in the absence of. So they have a trial in absentia and the person is ordered removed for missing court. The in absentia rate is often reported as if it's the rate at which people miss court, but it is actually not. It's a totally different measure. And specifically, the in absentia rate is the percent of cases that are completed in any given year, the percent of those cases that ended because an immigrant missed court. And that creates a really weird situation when you have huge backlogs, where more people show up in court every single year than ever complete their cases. And I like to give a really, I think, concise analogy for this. So say 10 people are scheduled to appear in court on any given day. That day, 9 people appear and 1 person misses court. The appearance rate for those people would be 90%, or you could say the failure to appear rate was 10%, 1 out of 10. So those 9 people show up for the court hearing, and the judge completes one other case. He orders completes one case. He orders the person who missed court deported, and he tells the other 8 people come back later. That day, the government reported in absentia rate would be 50%. 2 cases completed and 1 because an immigrant missed court, even though 90% of people showed up in court. And this is basically where we're at right now. For the last 10 years or so, this statistic has been largely meaningless because with growing court backlogs, we're in that situation where judges are telling more people to come back later than they are completing cases in any given year. So every time that happens, you effectively get this very distorted in absentia rate, and the government statistics become less and less correlated to the actual rate at which people appear in court.
So let's dive into this a little more. I appreciate your analogy because I think it's very important for people to understand this difference. But I think one thing that people say about this is that, well, what really matters at the end is those completed cases. Of those that have gotten to completion, how many were removed because they didn't show up. But you're saying that compared to the total number of hearings, that's just a tiny, tiny number of cases. Is that correct?
Exactly right. And so to give you a good sense of that, in most years, there are only a couple 100,000 completed cases, but there are usually, hundreds of thousands more cases where people showed up for their court hearings, and none of those are counted. And so this is particularly problematic because we are in a situation where people having to wait 4 or 5 years for their final hearings. So when you're using a 1-year snapshot, all you're getting are essentially those few cases that actually come to a conclusion and those cases where people miss court. You're ignoring essentially the millions of people who are showing up to court every single time, rigorously following every rule, and whose cases will not actually be evaluated until later. The other thing to note is that you could also look at this in what I sort of call the cohort way. And that is essentially looking at what percent of people in any given year are later ordered removed for missing court, because that could sort of solve the issue, right? Because if you're only concerned with how many people eventually show up to court, well, there you actually get a pretty similar statistic. So when I ran these numbers in 2019, for instance, it found that since 2015, over 80% of all immigrants placed into removal proceedings had appeared for all their court proceedings and avoided an order of removal for missing court. And when you go back even further, if you look at since 2007, so every case, looking at every single case begun since 2007 and going through to 2019, what was the ultimate outcome of those cases? Less than 25% of those cases ended because somebody missed court. And that doesn't take into account that 1 in 5 situation of people who later successfully reopen their court hearings.
Right. So what do you think your analysis means for this discussion around the managing the arrival of families at the border? Like, we're starting to see this already. Is there reports that Border Patrol is releasing people without notices to appear? But this idea that just releasing people into the country means they're just gonna disappear, right? The abscond rate. That's been the primary argument for family detention. And what you're saying is that's not necessarily a good argument.
Exactly. What it actually shows us is that we need robust case management services and systems in place to make sure that people don't miss court through no fault of their own. If the purpose of detention is to make sure that people appear in court, which is explicitly what the Supreme Court has said is, and in fact, Congress has said, is the purpose of detention, making sure people appear in court. Then knowing that the vast majority of people will appear in court if you give them the opportunity to do so, should mean that we start rethinking immigration detention. And it has to be noted, since immigration detention was reinstituted in the United States in the early 1980s, it was created as a way really not to ensure people don't show up into court, show up for court, but as a deterrent.
Mhm.
And I think that doesn't get talked about enough. Before 1980, we effectively had no system of immigration detention in the United States. And then in the early 1980s, the INS built the Chrome Detention Center in Miami, which still stands today, specifically to respond to arriving Haitian asylum seekers. Because not only was it thought that they would simply disappear or not show up to court, but the idea was if you lock up enough of them, it will discourage others from coming. And that is the sort of dirty secret behind detention. It's not about protecting communities. It's not about making sure people show up to court. It's about sending a message. But importantly, courts have repeatedly held you're not allowed to lock people up as a deterrent to others. Detention has to be specific to that person. The US government isn't allowed to say we're going to throw 20 people in jail so that 20 different people make a decision that we'd prefer. And so when you actually look at what's happening with families, they are showing up for court, but when they miss court, it's usually because of lack of familiarity with the system or government error. Then the only answer to coming out of that is reduce the use of detention and focus on improving the government systems that lead people to miss court and ensuring that people, when they get to their ultimate destination, have access to resources that help them actually follow the rules that we want them to follow.
So you may have already answered my next question, but if we see, an increase in families that are, accepted into the United States, if Title 42 is withdrawn, as many advocates want the Biden administration to do, or ruled illegal as there are existing court cases around it, what do you think the Biden administration will do, or maybe should do, if they are encountering more families at the border? Do you think they will resort to detention again, or do you think they're looking for other avenues?
Well, President Biden promised on the campaign trail to end family detention. And after taking office, he shut down the Berks Family Detention Center and converted the Carnes and Dilley family detention centers into effectively short-term quarantine facilities, though it's not exactly sure at this point what those locations will ultimately end up being used for. So we would hope that the Biden administration surges resources to case management programs around the country, of which there are hundreds, because there are robust networks of nonprofits that are ready and willing to sort of help create this network for receiving families and ensuring that they don't fall through the cracks. And some of the changes that the Biden administration could make are simple. For instance, the hearing notices and the notices to appear in court are all in English, and they are in small print legalese. In fact, there are no versions given to immigrants that are in their native languages. There's no online system where individuals can change their address with the court if they suddenly have to move. And many times we know for a fact that individuals who have check-ins with ICE don't realize that they have to tell both ICE and the court when they move. So you have situations where ICE may know what a person's new address is, but the ICE officer at their check-in never told them to file the right form with the immigration court, and they end up losing their case as a result. And so right now, many families, when they get to the country, get trapped in this Kafkaesque bureaucratic nightmare where they don't know how to navigate the system without an advocate. And so we think that the Biden administration should really focus on expanding case management programs to make sure people have an advocate and somebody who can walk them through the ridiculously complicated immigration court process so that they don't fall through the cracks through no fault of their own.
Well, Aaron, thank you very, very much for spending some time with us this week. Where can folks find your work on the internet and on social media if they want to follow you? Because you always have good takes on everything that's going on.
So we publish all of this research at the American Immigration Council's website. You can find our most recent report from Professor Eagley and Stephen Schaefer at called Measuring in Absentia, a report in immigration court. Measuring in absentia removals in immigration court. And you could also find me on Twitter at Reichlin-Melnick. That's ReichlnMelnick.
Thanks so much for joining us, Aaron. Really appreciate it.
Take care.
That's it for today's show. Before we go, A quick reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find more information on all the issues we discuss here on the show today at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow us on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. I'm Rachel Iacono. This Week in Immigration was created by Teresa Cardinal Brown. The executive producer of This Week in Immigration is Teresa Cardinal Brown. This week's episode was written by Teresa Cardinal Brown and myself. Yafet Tawahara and Ethan Plotkin produce and edit our show. See you next time on This Week in Immigration.